anything. No, you didn't. What does that even mean?
So this is a story that I've actually wanted to tell for a very long time. And I went ahead and I reached out to someone to make sure that this was an okay story to share. And I got that permission. And so I'm going to share with you guys a story about this. The question that this gentleman is asking is, when you're in the Appalachian Mountains, people often say, if you see or hear something, no, you didn't. There's a common belief that there's a lot of unexplained or maybe weird or strange or supernatural experiences that you experience when you're living or are going through the Appalachian Mountains. So the story I'm about to tell you guys is actually published in a actual book called The Grandfather Speaks, which was told by an elder, published by Interlink Books back in 1994. So the story goes is that a long time ago, the animals, the animal nations, and the people, they all lived together in great abundance. That so many animal nations existed that many of them don't even exist to today. And they lived in this great abundance. What is now the Appalachian Mountains or the Ohio River Valley. And one of these animals was called Wakwawi. And Wakwawi means stiff-legged bear. It was the biggest of all the animal nations. Had these stiff arms and kind of lumbered around, and it was covered in really thick and coarse hair and had hide that was thicker than any animal. And from its face came these horns. And these horns, they say, were sharp as spears. And Wakwawi was by nature a mean and destructive creature. And that for a long time, Wakwawi had victimized a lot of the other animal nations. And so one day they got sick of Wakwawi and his violence. And they decided that they were going to come together and make war against Wakwawi. So all the animals, and again, even animals that don't even exist anymore, they came together, the birds and the deer and the unknown nations. They came together to make war with Wakwawi. And the fight began. The battle began with Wakwawi. And they fought for so long, and there was so much death that they said that the land was stained red, that the rivers ran red with blood from the battle, the great battle. And despite them trying their absolute best, the animal nations started to suffer great losses. Even the great bear, like the bear who was the biggest and the strongest besides Wakwawi, they came to fight, but they got wounded and needed to be removed from the battlefield. The creator sat upon a rock watching his creation make war with one another and called forth the humankind, told the human nation, the nation of man, that they must join the fight against Wakwawi to bring balance. And so the mankind, they joined the battle. But even though they joined the battle, Wakwawi still was coming out victorious. After a while, when enough had been enough, the creator sat upon that flat rock on that hill and had lightning bolts and started to throw them at Wakwawi, started throwing and striking them down. One by one, they started to fall. They were running around and they were going crazy and still fighting with one another. That in this chaos, the Wakwawi was so big that it started to dig into the earth, and it started to knock things over, and it started to trample really hard through on the land. And that's what they say created the rolling hills of Appalachia. It's the pathways that Wakwawi would take when it would charge. And one by one, Wakwawi started to fall from Creator's bolts until there was one left. This last one was the biggest and the strongest, and it came and sort of the charge right at Creator. Creator, it took that lightning bolt and threw it down there, and it bounced off of his horns. His horns, he knocked the bolt out of the way. Kept charging, and finally he got hit and he got wounded by a lightning bolt. It was so hurt that it started to kind of drag itself, and it ran north. And when it ran, it drug itself across, and that's what they say created the Ohio River itself, was the indentation of it dragging itself as it ran away from the battle. And it was up in the north that they became prevalent, that they became a thing. But in the area now, they were gotten rid of in the Appalachia area. After everything was said and done, it was then realized that so many of these giants, so many of these creatures were killed. So many of these nations that that used to exist, ceased to exist. They fought themselves to extinction, battling Wakwawi. That the blood soaked into the ground. And so when you go to like Kentucky and you go to some of the Appalachian areas, you'll notice that that ground has red clay. That red clay, they say, is the blood of those who died in that battle. And they say that the Wakwawi remains are still to be found, and that nations later, like generations later after the war, that mankind continued to use tools from the remains of Wakwawi. And when you see what the remains are of the Wakwawi, you will discover that they look like this. That is what they have called Wakwawi. And those horns that were coming out of his face were tusks. And the hair that it had was woolly. And that his stiff legs were that of an elephant. And that it was fought with all the animal nations and humankind. That great war was to fight against Mastodon. Before this time, the food was granted in the area. Food was given to the people and the nations within the Ohio River Valley and Appalachia. And one of those foods was the cranberry. But it is said that the cranberry was not originally red, but that it became red when it was drenched in blood from the great battle with Wakwawi. And to tie this all together with the original statement, which is why, Appalachia is kind of creepy. And from the words of the elder who was quoted in that book, I read you this. This is why the land now called Kentucky was called the dark and bloody ground, because of all the blood that spilled there. It became a common hunting ground for various tribes, as no one would set up a village there, being greatly afraid of the ghost of those slain giants. We as North American people, generally speaking, have a greater knowledge of the myths and legends that come from overseas. But we have a creation story here too. We have mythologies here too. And I hope that this one made you happy a little bit and maybe sparked some thought and imagination as to why things are the way they are and why they feel the way that they feel with the land that you are occupying and that you live on today. So have a good night.